Assalamu alaikum. So, one of the major differences between the Shi'i way of doing jurisprudence and the Sunni way of doing jurisprudence is that the Shi'i jurisprudence has a specific design in which when you are trying to find proof for any legal declaration, you will go through the amarat, that means dalil shar'i. Either it's from the Quran, the Sunnah, or dalil shar'i aqli, right, which is like a rational deduction which has legal discovery. And if you cannot find it, we go to the next step, which are the practical procedures, which are usul amaliyah, which hopefully through the end of the course we will be discussing that in detail. In the Sunni jurisprudential deduction, they don't have a thing called practical procedures. This is why they always try to increase the amount of amarat in their process of deduction. So at first it's Quran and Sunnah. Then they had to add qiyas. Then they had to add Sunnah al-Sahabi, the Sunnah of the companion. Then they had to add Sunnah al-Tabi'i. The more that they go in time, they realize that there are a lot of things missing and they don't have practical procedures, so they have to justify the evidence of things that come later on, to the point where they go through ijma' and then ijma' al-ulama, and then you have Amir al-Mu'mineen in fiqh and Amir al-Mu'mineen in hadith and Amir al-Mu'mineen in what? Just so you can justify even an opinion of somebody that came 500-600 years after and make it into a legal opinion. That's a very important thing to note. So the design of Shi'i jurisprudence in Ilm al-Usul differs from the Sunni in this particular method, is that when we do not have an amara, we don't look for another amara. We just have another step, which are the practical procedures, and we will deduce that way. Now, Ilm al-Usul, or the Usuli books, as we started in this very unorganized introduction, that it is a filler science to fill the gaps and fill the voids. So this way, everything that you need to deduct rulings, you would have it researched in a certain place. Amongst these fillers is hujjiyatul qada, or the binding nature of certainty. Now, the Usulis, they agree that this has nothing to do with Ilm al-Usul, however, it must be researched. The reason is because the highest amount of knowledge that you can gain in any single issue is certainty. So you want to know, is this certainty binding? Because if certainty is not binding, then obviously doubt is not going to be binding, and obviously suspicion is not going to be binding. And then basically close your books. Because if you cannot gain certainty, or certainty is not binding, then nothing else is binding. So it's a very interesting discourse that needs to be discussed for both types of evidences, for the amarat and for the practical procedures. In fact, the goal of Ilm al-Usul is to gain certainty in claiming that all of the evidences that they use in the process of deduction are binding. Because if you don't have certainty that the evidence is valid, that becomes extremely problematic. The design of Muhammad Baqir Sadr's book is very different compared to the other Usuli books. The Usuli books, usually they begin with the linguistics, and then they begin with the rational, and then they begin with the practical procedures. And everybody has their own flavor and own reasoning as to why they basically put their discourses this way. Muhammad Baqir Sadr's view on designing all of the halaqat is basically how you would work as a mujtahid trying to deduce a law. So basically, the first thing that we look for is to gain certainty. If we don't have certainty, we go into the amarat. We see, do we have any amara in a particular subject? If we don't have amara, we look at the dalil shar'i aqli. Do we have a rational legal deduction that we can? If we cannot, we go to the practical procedures that are muhriza. It means practical procedures that have an amara to deal with them, such as asalat al-tahara or whatever. If we do not have the practical procedures, we go to asalat al-bara'a or asalat al-ishtighal. So based on the design of how a mujtahid should deduce a hukum are the contents of his fundamentals. So the content of this book is basically designed on the procedure that you would naturally take in deducting a law. So this is why it's much more organized, and it gives you a method of practice. So when somebody comes up with a question and they say, okay, if I were to try to answer it, what's my first step? You already know. Can I get certainty from any way about the subject? You cannot. You go to the amarat, which amarat are hujjah. And you go through all of these discourses. You cannot find any amara. Go to the practical procedures that were from amarat. You can't find anything. You go into the usul amaliyah and you finally go. This is interesting because you notice that some of the fuqaha, you could tell what type of usul they've been reading or they're used to based on how they answer questions. So if you, without mentioning any names, if somebody were to ask a certain question, then you say, al-asl, that means in principle this is allowed, but we have a hadith. So what do you mean, but you have a hadith? Well, you start off with, we have a hadith 1, 2, 3, and then you could say the dalala on it, and then we go to the asl. So it helps you to keep your mind very organized. That being said, we're looking for the binding nature of certainty. This is the first thing. And by binding nature, what do we mean? In ilm al-usul, every time we say this is binding or this is hujjah, we mean two things. We mean that it is munajjiz and it is mu'adhar. Munajjiz means that you have the license to do so. For example, you read a hadith that tells you it is wajib to pray Salat al-Fajr before the sun rises. So you look at the sun didn't rise yet, you pray Salat al-Fajr. This action, you have the license to do this action. Meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot punish you for committing this action because you have an evidence to support you. And mu'adhar at the same time it's excusable. That means if you committed this and it turned out in actual life, in actuality, in the hukm al-waqi'i, it turned out that what you did was wrong, you're excused from it. In the same scenario, you have a hadith that says you have to pray Salat al-Fajr before the sun rises. You pray Salat al-Fajr. It turns out, in actuality, that no, Salat al-Fajr is after the sun rises, for example. You are excused. Why? Because you had an evidence to tell you to do otherwise. So this gives you hujjiyah. If something is munajjiz and mu'adhar, that means you have the license and permission to commit the action and it's excusable, that means it is binding. Now the question is certainty binding in the usuli sense? That means it is munajjiz and it is mu'adhar. It's a little tricky here. Muhammad Baqir Sadr says certainty when it comes to logic is rationally binding. Doesn't even need any type of proof. if you gain certainty that 1 plus 1 is equal to 2 is equal to 2, no matter what anybody else convinces you of. Logic dictates that when you are certain, you must act on your certainty. You base your decisions on your certainty, regardless of what they are in reality. No rational person will tell you that you should go against your certainty. Certainty also is a motivating factor and a moving factor, in the sense that if you are thirsty and you want water, and you know that water is 5 meters from here, you will get up and walk 5 meters to get to that water. What moved you existentially is your certainty. However, that does not necessitate that certainty is binding in the usuli sense, that it is munajjis and mu'addar, except if you were to agree with a conclusion beforehand. You are certain that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said it is wajib for you to pray Fajr prayers. Okay, now I have this certainty. I know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants this from me. Now, why do I have to do it? What constitutes this certainty binding to my action? Over here, Muhammad Baqir Sadr says, certainty is only binding if you believe that the Creator has the right to obedience. If this circle is missing, then your certainty is worthless completely. Once you agree that Allah has the right to obedience and you must obey Him because He created you, and now you are certain that He wants you to do X, Y, and Z, in this stage, your certainty is binding. Otherwise, it is not binding at all. And this is why when we say the process of deduction is not purely jurisprudential, because this question in itself, does Allah have the right to obedience, it's not also the question. This is a question in ilm al-kalam, and it's a philosophical question, it is a logical question, it's everything outside of ilm al-usul. However, and this is why Muhammad Baqir Sadr says that the rationale concludes that God has the right to obedience. According to which rational thing? He says this at this stage, I have no proof for you. But between you and yourself, you know for a fact that the rationale dictates that God has the right to obedience. And in the Day of Judgment, we'll find out. You could lie to me and be like, hey, God does not have the right to obedience. And you win the argument there at that point, because I have no proof to give to you. But in the Day of Judgment, it's between you and your mind. What do you think? Does God have the right to obedience or not? Of course, we're not going to go through the subject. This is just to start off so we know the structure of the process of deduction, that we try to gain certainty. And now from this, when we say that certainty is binding to the level that we agree that God has the right to obedience. Now, how big is this right? How big is the circle? How small is the circle? Again, these are not usuli subjects. These are left to ilm al-kalam. And this is why you have to keep wary over here that no matter how much you agree with the principles, ilm al-kalam and ideology, theology, your personal philosophy will have a direct impact in your process of deduction, because these are not discussed here. I could tell you that, for example, the principles, and you could agree with them completely, and then you'll end up with very different conclusions, because there is a direct impact. If somebody believes that God does not have the right to obedience, or believe that God only has the right to forbid, or believe only God has the right to ordain, over here you will come up with a different fiqh naturally. So keep this in mind, that certainty has hujjiyah only if God has the right to the right of obedience, and every Muslim agrees that God has the right of obedience. How big is the circle? How small is that circle? Not to be discussed here. But since we can conclude here that the qat' for sure, like certainty, is the maximum amount of knowledge that we can have, what our attempt is for all of the evidences that come. So for example, when we discuss the Quran, we're going to discuss the exterior binding reality. So for example, when you're reading a verse, it has apparency, and apparency has probability. Probability has 50-60%. So the maximum you would get from reading a verse is a 60% chance that this is what God meant to say. Is this binding? If it's binding, we need to achieve certainty that it's binding so we can use it as an evidence. We're going to check the single narrators. The single narrators give us 50-60% chance that it was issued by the Ma'soom. Is that binding? To make it binding, we need to have certainty that it's binding to us. Otherwise, we will be stuck into a loop where we have a non-binding evidence proving that a non-binding evidence should be binding. And then we're gonna just be moving in circle. This is why it is very important, even though Muhammad Baqir Sadr believes that Hujjiyat al-Qata' is not part of Ilm al-Usul, and this is something that's outside of it, but it should be discussed beforehand, because when we are discussing the evidences of Ilm al-Usul, we are going to try to achieve certainty in all of these aspects. So from here, we are going to start dwelling in a little bit. We'll go with the Al-Ilm al-Ijmali next chapter, and then we'll take it step by step to see where we end up. Assalamu alaikum.